Move on to the exciting part, where we consider infectious diseases and human conditions. As we've already learned, the vast majority of microorganisms that associate with humans cause no harm. In fact, most of them are beneficial to us, and we've even figured out ways to utilize them to do things for us. However, the stuff we're really interested in is how humankind is also plagued by nearly 2,000 different microbes that cause various types of diseases. Now, in many populations, infectious diseases still devastate them. The World Health Organization estimates there are a total of 10 billion new infections across the world every single year. Infectious diseases, in fact, are amongst the most common cause of death in much of humankind, and they still kill a significant percentage of the US population, but not nearly as much as they do other places in the world. Let's take a look at some of the microbes that cause infectious diseases. You'll notice of all the different diseases that we have in this list, only a few of them are caused by infectious microbes. Out of this whole list, we're only looking at influenza and pneumonia, septicemia or infections of the blood, some respiratory infections, HIV and AIDS is viral, some diarrheal diseases, and then tuberculosis. But our predominant killers are heart disease, cancer, stroke, lower respiratory disease, and so on and so forth. In fact, if we get outside of the United States and take a look at the role of infectious diseases versus other death causes in countries that have varying incomes, we'll see some interesting trends. Now, this one may be fairly obvious, but low-income countries have a much higher incidence of communicable diseases, maternal and perinatal conditions, as well as nutritional deficiencies. That is, most people either die from infections or from issues surrounding development, birth, and growth. What's interesting, when we look at very high-income countries, we're still predominantly influenced by chronic diseases. These diseases include things like cardiovascular disease and cancers, respiratory disorders, diabetes, and such. There's also an increasing number of emerging diseases or re-emerging diseases like SARS or AIDS or hepatitis C or viral encephalitis. These examples are diseases that cause severe mortality and morbidity. We'll also notice that to balance this trend, there have also been some advances in the eradication of diseases like polio and measles or leprosy, and certainly eradication of some of the diseases caused by parasitic worms. Another interesting thing is that many diseases that used to not be considered infectious probably do involve microbial infections. The most famous of these is gastric ulcers, which we now know are a result of the Helicobacter pylori. But there are more that we're finding out even now, that certain cancers are possibly caused by microorganisms. Schizophrenia could have a possible link to microorganism infection, multiple sclerosis, even obsessive compulsive disorder or coronary artery disease. This is a really interesting and growing field of study of microbiology. Certainly we'll take a look into it as we move throughout the semester. In these areas, again, low-income countries differ from high-income countries. It seems that almost 26% of cancers in low-income countries are caused by viruses and bacteria, whereas less than 7% of them are caused by viruses or bacteria in the developed world. Let's have a quick concept check. If you were to study HIV, what sort of microbiologist would you be considered? A bacteriologist? A protozoologist? A mycologist? Or a virologist? So the question really is HIV caused by bacteria, protozoans, fungi, or viruses? Well, you're probably pretty familiar. It's viruses. So we'll go with virologist. So as I introduced earlier, there are two basic cell lines that appeared during evolutionary history. These two lines were the prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. These cells differ not only in the complexity of their cell structure, but also in their contents. These are the cellular microorganisms, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. In general, a prokaryotic cell is about 10 times smaller than a eukaryotic cell. And it also lacks many of the cell structures, such as the organelles that we see inside of a eukaryotic cell. Here on the left, you can see a prokaryotic cell. Very simple. It's got a cell membrane, sometimes a cell wall in addition to that cell membrane, and it has a nuclear region. It has some ribosomes and certainly chromosomes, but it lacks entirely membrane-bound organelles that we see inside of a eukaryotic cell. Here we see a nucleus that's bound in membrane, as well as components of the cellular transport system, the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus, as well as some mitochondria to generate energy, and numerous other membrane-bound organelles. Now, something to consider is that all prokaryotes are microorganisms, but only some eukaryotes are microorganisms, because eukaryotic organisms can be multicellular and they could be very large, thus no longer microorganisms. Let's take a look at some of these microorganism examples. This figure gives you a great idea of scale. We have 5 types of microorganisms that we'll be interested in this semester. We'll be looking at some viruses, we'll be looking at some bacteria, some protozoans, some fungus, and then a few helminths. For example, here we're showing a tapeworm. Now the tapeworm is much larger than you see as a human hair, which has been placed here to give us some perspective of size. Here's a size that many protozoans would be, as well as some fungus. Again, much smaller than the tapeworm itself. If we look at the fungus enlarged, we'll see here that bacteria are much tinier than the fungus, or these single-celled protozoans up here. Now, as you know, the human hair is visible to the naked eye, and thus, this Teniasolium, or tapeworm, is certainly visible to the human eye. However, when we move to the protozoans or the fungus, and certainly down to the bacteria, we are really in the micro realm, and it's going to require a microscope for viewing these. In fact, viruses are so small, they're barely detectable under a regular light microscope. So now let's consider viruses. Viruses are subject to some intense study by microbiologists. As we mentioned before, they're not independently living organisms. Instead, they're small particles that exist on a level somewhere between the complexity of large molecules and small single cells. They are much simpler than cells because all they're really made of is DNA or RNA, nucleic acids, wrapped in a protein coat, and sometimes coated by a lipid membrane. You can see 2 types of viruses shown over here. The individual particles are called virus particles or virons. And the main reason that we don't consider them to be living organisms is because when they're inside their host organism, in the intracellular state, viruses usually only exist in forms of genetic material. And that genetic material confers a partial genetic program on the host organism. That is, it takes over the host organism's machinery. So these viral particles essentially empty themselves into the host, insert their DNA into the host's genome, and then that DNA takes over the host machinery to manufacture more viruses, which escape from the cell and then are passed on. So hopefully you get a good understanding here about the differences between cellular microorganisms and viral or non-cellular microorganisms. So on the cellular level, we have prokaryotic cells, or bacteria, and on eukaryotic cells, which would be things like the fungus and the protozoans. Then we have multicellular eukaryotes, like our Teniascoli up there, the tapeworm.